Oh, baby. We are here for a massive Week 17 Fantasy Football Championship Week. I'm, of course, your host, Flex Shane. You can follow me on Twitter at the Flex Network 1. Check us out at DFS Army as well. And, of course, dfsarmy.com. Just a fantastic website. We have a lot of course, VIP membership content on that website. But we also have a lot of free content. If you want to just jump over, see what we're all about, dfsarmy.com, dfsarmy.com. But listen, if you are listening to the show today, it's because either you are in the fight of your life for the championship weekend, next weekend, week 17, of course, or maybe you're battling for third place. Listen, in most leagues, you're still going to cash out if you finish third. So there's still something to play for. You got to cover that league due, of course. And then, listen, there are some maniacal leagues out there that actually play in week 18. So maybe this is your trip to the championship. So hopefully you're not in any leagues like that, because a lot of crazy things can happen in the final season of the NFL season. But our approach all season has been to target waiver wire players that could either A, add depth, or B, be that scratch-off lottery ticket. And so far this season, we've been pretty successful, I would say. But this week, I want to take a slightly different approach. Yes, we're still going to talk about some potential waiver wire ads, but I also want to talk to you about some of the players that have sneaky, let's call it sleeper potential coming into next week. But let's first talk about the picture going into next week. So from an injury perspective, we actually escaped this weekend. Knock on wood, we still have one more game to play. I'm recording this the afternoon of December 26th. So we still have the Colts versus the Chargers tonight. But for the most part, we escaped injuries. Greg Dulcich had the hamstring injury. Christian Watson had the hip injury. And then, not necessarily directly fantasy relevant, but the Cincinnati Bengals right tackle, Lyle Collins, tore his ACL. So he's done for the season. Now, from a Bengals perspective, you're starting your studs, right? You're starting your T, you're starting your Chase, you're starting your Joe Burrow, who, my God, he looks. The second half of the season, he's looked electric, absolutely just demolishing the Patriots last week. So congratulations to Joe Burrow. But luckily, there's been no major injuries. But that Christian Watson injury and his potential to miss last week does buoy one particular player that we want to talk about. But as a whole, some of the things that we definitely suggest this weekend when you're building your lineups is look for teams with something to play for. Now, the good news is, even at the top of the heap, in the AFC side of things, both the Chiefs and the Bills are battling for that coveted number one overall seed, because, of course, a few years ago they changed it so that only the number one seed gets the bye. So that's important, right? In the NFC side of things, it's the same deal. The Eagles lost last week, which means they're now 13-2, and they're going to be battling for that coveted first spot, pretty much just between them and the Vikings. But the Cowboys still do have an outside shot at potentially being able to go and usurp the Eagles for that top spot overall. So that would require the Eagles to lose out. Probably not going to happen, but it could happen. The good news, though, is that Jalen Hurts is looking like he's going to play next week. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of this, because one of the things I actually want to start to show off by talking about is just a few DSTs, defensive special teams positions that you can stream in week 17. And the number one team that I'm looking at is the Jacksonville Jaguars going up against the Houston Texans. So the beautiful thing here is that the Jaguars are likely still available on your waiver wire. They're only rostered in 9% of leagues over on Sleeper. They are the number 7 defense on the season. It's shocking, I know, and especially because they've had the last 3 weeks where they've scored double-digit points in every single week for the last 3 weeks. This week, they're going up against Houston, who is the number 3 matchup for defensive special teams units. And the best part about this is the Jaguars, they have a ton to play for. They're currently sitting as the number 1 seed. Yes, that's true. I said it correctly. The number 1 seed in the AFC South at 7-8. And this week, the Houston Texans, they don't have crap to play for. So, fantastic streamer. Now, if the Jags aren't available, or you want to look at another team, the Chargers going up against the Rams, only rostered in 22% of leagues. The Rams are the number 4 best team to face. And finally, the Giants versus Indianapolis. Giants are only rostered in 16% of leagues, and they are the number 1 team to go against is Indianapolis. So those are three streamers that are viable options. Jacksonville Jaguars, without a doubt, are not my number one choice this week. Now, let's talk about some of the positions. At the running back position, this one's going to be really quick. I really have two players that are worth rostering. At this point, you don't need handcuffs because there's been no major injuries. We got 1 week left. There's no point. There's really no opportunities for these players to emerge because there was no major injuries last week, right? So there's no backups that are going to be rostering. But I still have Deion Jackson and Zach Moss as the top waiver wire pickups at the running back position. Now, Jonathan Taylor, of course, is going to be out for the rest of the season. We still have the game tonight where we don't really definitively know if Deion Jackson or Zach Moss is going to be those top choices. But we do know that next week, again, they're playing against the Giants. So if one of these players does emerge, my money is going to be on Deion Jackson. Neon Dion, baby, is going to emerge. But we do know that last week, Zach Moss had the plurality of the touches. So I worry a little bit. It's going to be game script dependent. It's obviously going to be Zach Moss in early down situations, obvious running situations, and then Deion Jackson in obvious passing situations. Jeff Saturday, interim head coach for the Indianapolis Colts, said that he's going to play a hot hand approach. So I would expect Deion Jackson is going to catch that hot hand, but we'll see. Those are the only two players right now that I would consider picking up on the waiver wire at the running back position to really move some needles. Now, listen, if your league actually has Cam Akers available, Cam Akers was the number one running back, period. Again, I guess we still have one game to play tonight. Austin Eckler could still get that crown, but going into tonight, Cam Akers was the number one player. He had 3 touchdowns, so he's coming on hot. He's rostered in pretty much every league, so he's likely not available in your league. But hey, listen, if he is, he's definitely worth a player streaming. Now let's go to the wide receiver position because the number one player that I want to talk to you about is Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. Now, Allen Lazard, of course, would be the biggest beneficiary if Christian Watson does miss time because Allen Lazard is the number one wide receiver, but he's rostered in over 85% of leagues. So Romeo Doubs is rostered in only 52% of leagues. So it's 48% of leagues he's available. Now, the one thing I always say is that 50% is kind of that Mendoza line, but Romeo Doubs was close enough to that line that I wanted to include him in this analysis. And here's the thing. If you want to close your eyes and figure out what's the dream matchup for the wide receiver position going into week 17 of your fantasy football championships, that's going up against the Minnesota Vikings. Of course, Romeo Doubs is going to go up against the Minnesota Vikings. From a fab perspective, you can't take it with you. This is the week you use it all. If Romeo Doubs is available on your waiver wire, you put 100% of your waiver wire budget on Romeo Doubs with the possibility that Christian Watson's going to miss time. We saw that through the first 8 games of the season where Romeo Doubs was healthy, he had instant rapport with Aaron Rodgers. He was averaging over 6 targets per game, and he was producing as a wide receiver, albeit a low-end wide receiver, but a wide receiver 3, somebody that you would consider flexing. Remember, he was like the hot pickup. Now, listen, from an actual pure talent perspective, I actually don't love Romeo Doubs. But Aaron Rodgers has spoken out as him being a very, very crisp route runner. And we know that Aaron Rodgers threw some shade at Christian Watson just last week, basically saying, if you want to catch touchdowns, you got to make sure you run the right route. And guess what Romeo Doubs does very, very well? He runs the right route. Romeo Doubs, 100% of your fab. Officially, I have 10% on the sheet, but 100% of your fab, go for the gold with Romeo Doubs. Next player I want to talk to you about, again, it's a short list, but Greg Dortch to the Arizona Cardinals. He just had a career week. DeAndre Hopkins let down, and so did Marquise Brown. But Greg Dortch last week caught 10 of 11 targets for 98 yards, and he also rushed 3 times for 25 yards. Greg Dortch to torch. We saw early in the season when Rondale Moore was missing time that he was a viable streamer, flex type position. This week, of course, it's going to be a little bit risky, but he's going up against the Falcons, and that's a pretty favorable matchup. He's the 3rd wide receiver on that team with possibly a backup to a backup at the starting quarterback position, so it's a little bit risky. But if you are desperate, if you're just decimated with injuries, and I have some teams, especially in Dynasty, that there was an issue, if you have Greg Dortch, I would be okay starting him as like that second flex type spot in a desperate situation. And then finally, we knew last week that somebody on the Giants was going to explode. I thought it was going to be Darius Slayton. It ended up being Isaiah Hodgins, New York Giants. He's only rostered in 7% of leagues. maybe a buck or two. He caught 8 of his 11 targets, which is fantastic. 89 yards in their loss to the Vikings on Saturday. Again, a little bit of a risky proposition, but just based on the fact that Giants face Indy this week, again, potentially a favorable matchup. Now, let's talk about the quarterback position from a streamer's perspective. Brock Purdy, man, he continues to be consistently fantasy viable. He's still only rostered in 11% of leagues, but he can show that he can keep himself fantasy relevant, scoring between 18 to 20 points in the last 3 weeks. But in addition to that, he's keeping his fantasy skill position players, George Kittle in particular, fantasy relevant. So we want to see that continue. This week they play the Raiders, who've allowed the 7th most fantasy points against to opposing quarterbacks this season, which is pretty darn good. They're averaging 255 yards and about 1.5 passing touchdowns through the air. Now, if Purdy can get 2 passing touchdowns, get to 255 yards, maybe get 15 to 20 yards on the ground, he's sitting pretty close to 18 to 20 points. If he gets a 3rd touchdown, he's probably closer to 23, 24 points. Definitely a viable streaming option this week if you're desperate at the quarterback position. And guess what? If you have players that are right around that end of the QB1 or high-end QB2, that's where Brock Purdy is for a conversation for this week only. Now, I've kept Gardner Minshew on the list here. He's only rostered in 9% of leagues. We saw this week that he put up 24 points. He was not – if you lost your matchup because you lost Jalen Hurts, but you were able to get Gardner Minshew was not the reason you lost this week. Now, listen, Minshew doesn't have the same 40-point upside that Jalen Hurts does every single week, but he's a very viable backup quarterback. And in Week 17, they play the Saints. So if Hurts can't make it, and now they're saying that he's going to really push to try to play, but if Hurts can't, Gardner Minshew is a perfectly acceptable streaming option. Let's move on to the tight end position, and let's get the hell out of here. We're hot, we're quick, we're giving you just the hits today. Let's talk about Juwan Johnson. Yes, I talk about this guy every single week, and every single week I say he's a boom or bust player. Guess what? Last week, it was his time for bust. Yes, I know. It's painful. It's frustrating. But again, we know New Orleans is going up against Philadelphia, which is not an easy matchup for tight ends. Don't get me wrong, but if you don't have an elite, call it Travis Kelce, George Kittle at this stage of the season as a viable option at tight end, you might be desperate. And Juwan Johnson is as good a likelihood as any at getting into the end zone. I like him this week. Now, a player that everything tends to come full circle, but Tyler Conklin of the New York Jets. And yes, sweet, beautiful baby boy, Mike White. It sounds like he may be able to play. He was getting testing again on his ribs because he had broken ribs. He's getting tested again on Monday, the 26th, to see if he's going to be a viable option for next week. Now, if Mike White plays, I definitely like Tyler Conklin's chances even better. But even if he doesn't and you're stuck with Zach Wilson or whoever the hell the backup's going to be this week, I would still consider it. The thing here is that they're playing the Seattle Seahawks, the number 1 matchup available for the tight end position. So I love Tyler Conklin this week as a streamer play. And of course, Chiggy Okonkwo, Tennessee. Listen, he busted this week. Malik Willis. The risk has been he can't really keep any of these pass catchers fantasy relevant, and that's been the case. So Chiggy Okonkwo, he was a sexy name the last couple of weeks. He's a risky play. I have him on the list just because most of the other tight ends are rostered, but Chiggy Okonkwo, risky proposition for Tennessee this week. And so that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for the Waiver Wire Show. We're going to be here next Saturday to talk about our favorite flex plays on the week. And very similar to what we did last week, we're going to go through each game and analyze it from a season-long perspective to say, these are the players that we're comfortable starting this week, and these are the players that we're not comfortable starting this particular week. So make sure you join us 10:30 a.m. Eastern every Saturday morning. We're at the final show of the season talking about the regular season. Make sure you're there. So with that, I will bid you good luck in Week 17, and please let's take home some championships for DFS Army. Good luck, everybody.
Big time, knowing that diamonds in my